All right, we are ready for some more world building here for Old School Essentials. Thanks for everybody for feedback and subscribing and giving me some things to think about. But this is session 3 of this exercise, and maybe just start off with a quick recap of what we're trying to accomplish. Basically, I'm setting up the core starting hex for a Old School Essentials hex crawl or open table gaming environment. We'll see what, if any, of that happens, but basically trying to generate the first hex where all the adventures would start off. Last session, we went about populating the terrain and some of the features that were in the hex, and you'll see that on the screen right now. To go along with that, and I think where I'll start off is, really part of this was going to be an exercise in doing the Gygax 75 challenge. And so for those of you who are just joining, the Gygax 75 challenge is a kind of an online resource. Goes way back to the beginning of D&D, and it's basically a method for DMs to go ahead and create an environment in which their players can play. And it's a 5-step process. It's supposed to go over a handful of weeks if you stick to a particular schedule. You start with the concept of what your play is going to be. You sketch out the surrounding area, which is very much what we did last session. You're going to sketch out a dungeon, town features, and the larger world. And so, like I just hinted at last session, I kind of focused on this surrounding area part of the exercise or part of the challenge. But what I didn't do is really talk through the results themselves. I mean, we created or I created the map and the contents, but I didn't tie it into the Gygax 75 challenge. So, well, maybe let's start there really quickly. It won't take too long, but one of the things I've done since the last session is I've started to pull all the content and the things that we've decided into a platform called Scrivener, which I find really good for documentation and keeping track of ideas and things like that. Let me know if you want to know more about it, about Scrivener in the context of world building and role-playing games, but not going to go into too much detail for that now. But basically, as far as the Gygax 75 challenge goes, we are in this section here for week 2, the surrounding area. The exercise for this section is basically starting off with hex paper. You want to create one settlement of significant size, and I have that right here in the middle of the map, a village called Shaford. I will let you know that Shaford is really kind of a lightly disguised village of Hamlet from Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. But that's going to be the core starting place for the PCs in this game. The next step in the challenge, creating 2 other settlements, camps, larger or smaller towns, a keep, et cetera, et cetera. Now I've got quite a bit more of this just because of the random system that I'm using. So I've got a couple of small towns, I've got a thorp, I've got a single dwelling, a couple of ruins, a hamlet. But yeah, I've got all these other settlements are identified or at least placed in the map. The challenge calls for 1 major terrain feature. And again, going back to the randomized system that I used and highlighted in the first and second episodes, I do have a number of depressions, and so these red dots are depressions, and so those are going to serve as the terrain features. The challenge asks for 1 mysterious site to explore, and so these ruins on my map are that mysterious site. And if you're familiar with the village of Hamlet, you'll probably also familiar with the moat house, and that's going to be the location of the moat house. It also asks to identify 1 dungeon entrance, and I've got ruins here. And in the week 3 part of the Gygax challenge, we will go ahead and blow out that dungeon and give it a lot of detail, but that's also on the map. And then the last aspect is creating a random encounters table. And from the earlier sessions, you'll know that I'm relying on the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide for a lot of tables and terrain and things like that, but also for random encounter tables. And so there is an uninhabited table for temperate conditions like we have for my core hex, and we're in plain, so typically we're using this table for uninhabited areas, and there's also a table for inhabited areas, right? And I haven't translated those or pulled those into a document for my own use, but I'll probably do that offline. Okay, so that's pretty much week 2 of the Gygax challenge. And for the rest of this session, I basically just want to get some of these details fleshed out on this map. So first of all, I've cleaned up the map in Worldographer. So I've made the labels a little bit easier to read, a little less crowded, and things like that. So the first thing I want to tackle is the depressions. And so these depressions, represented by the red dots, were generated from the terrain generation from the Dungeon Master's Guide. But the Dungeon Master's Guide doesn't really give you a whole lot to go on as far as what those depressions could represent. I mean, I think they actually only give you 4 or 5 options. And so I was looking around for a solution for this, and I did find this in a potential solution, at least in this filling in the blanks book that I used last session. And there's kind of a neat section here for uh, geologic features, and one of them is actually a change in elevation. So I'm going to try to use that to flesh out our depressions. It's a short handful of random tables. And did I end up on the wrong page? Change in elevation. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay, change in elevation. So there are a handful of tables, and it'll get us a sense of how deep these depressions are. And so I'm going to roll for that off screen and enter those results into Scrivener so we've got those details. All right, I completed that part of things, and yeah, I had 3 depressions, and okay, chill out there, Worldographer. 3 depressions, red dots, 1, 2, 3, and I rolled against filling in the blanks, and across these tables came up with a short description, which I entered in Scrivener. It's a depression, it's a gorge, the change is natural but out of place or the result of natural violence. The land is 115 yards lower than the surrounding area. Subterranean is shrublands. And since there were only a few of those, I just decided to make, well, I didn't really decide, I kind of actually rolled for it, but ultimately the depressions actually ended up very similar descriptions and just a little variance in this depth. Not sure how much of a big deal that is, but nice to have that detail. Okay, so what else do we have? Resources. So I've got a couple of hexes. Looks like, say, 1, 2, 3 hexes with a resource value that's supposed to come out of it from the random determination. And definitely going to use filling in the blanks again. And if I go to the resources section, the main table is down here, and it's basically, is the resource going to be animal, mineral, or vegetable? And just kind of longer term, I mean, the importance of this is ultimately PCs could mine the minerals, or they could harvest the vegetables, or they could hunt the game and animals, and that could create experience points and coin for them, income for them. There's a larger game that's far, far, far down the road that gets into domain building. But ultimately, I want to use these tables from filling in the blanks to identify what's going on in the 3 hexes um, that are labeled resources. So also going to do that offline, and I'm going to pause it here for just a moment. All right, I completed the details for those 3 resource hexes. Probably not quite as smooth as I'd like. There seems to be some missing information or details in filling in the blanks, or at least I didn't understand what they were going for. But no matter, I've got 3 hexes with some details. Here in 3827, there's an industrial vegetable. It's basic, it's wood, luxury, madrone, which I had to look up on Google. But yeah, just as an example, and you'll see over here on my map, I've got madrone resource. I've got that labeled as such. And I've done that for all 3 of the hexes. So we've got madrone, marshmallow, and gypsum in those resource hexes. All right, the next item on my list is this sign right here. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this one, but I am going to use it as a sign of this gypsum in the adjacent hex, simply because the way I rolled up that gypsum resource is that it's actually hidden. And so maybe the PCs will pick up on that as they run about. So I'll do that next. And then let's see, after that, I've got a couple of ruins that I want to add some details to, although, as I said before, one of the ruins is actually the moat house from the village of Hamlet. So let's look at this one on 4124. We're going to jump over to our D30 companion, sandbox companion. And there is a ruins generator. It was on page 20, or is that 19? And it'll get me to the type of ruin, the character of the decay, if there are any inhabitants. And like I suggested earlier, this is going to start as the foundation for week 3 of the Gygax challenge, which is going to be the dungeon generation. So let's get some characteristics on these ruins, and that'll serve as the basis for the dungeon in the next session. So I'm going to roll that offline. All right, I've got those details created for the ruins. It was a noticeably charred or burned hamlet that is now got an infestation of undead skeletons. Seems appropriate for early levels. All right, what else we got? Let's see, 2 more things I want to do. There's this structure entry up here in the mountain hex, and then a geologic entry in the plains hex. Both of those are also going to be subject to the randomization from filling in the blanks. So for instance, here is a structure section, which will give us burial grounds and monuments and dwellings, fortifications, infrastructure, etc. And then also, we saw a little bit of the geologic when I was doing the depressions, but we'll see what comes out of that when we do it randomized: caves, rock, soil, water, terrain, etc., etc. So let me do those quickly offline here. All right, I finished the details for those 2 items. I've got a monument here in the mountains and some caves here in the plains. Both of them are actually pretty interesting. The monument is built to honor a concept such as law or chaos. And there are some details. It's also kind of actually a 2-room dungeon in a way, but I'll flesh that out. And for the geologic feature, it was a caves, 5 chambers, and again, I need to stock that when I get the appetite to do so. All right, so that's pretty much all of the features. And then the last thing I wanted to do for this session is start on the settlements that are not Schaefered. So remember, Schaefered is our home base here in the center of the hex, but we've got a hamlet and I think 2 small towns and a thorp and a single dwelling. So for this episode, I just want to give those some names and get that set up to flesh those out perhaps next session. So what I was thinking about doing is there's a lot of name generators online. There's one for Donjon. They've got a fantasy setting, name generator for towns and cities, and let me click the generate button. And let me review these lists and update my map, and I'll get back to you in just a second. All right, I've got my randomly generated names. I've got Orland, Keton, Wygate, and then, Bizaraz. And then there was a single dwelling over here, and I didn't really have too many details. I thought maybe I'd just kind of leave that as a wild card and maybe come up with something interesting over there later. Maybe a hermit or something. We'll see. All right, that's going to do it for this session. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you've got any feedback, what you want to see next. But definitely next session, we'll get in the next week of the Gygax challenge where we'll be fleshing out our dungeon and maybe do a little bit more with these civilizations, these settlements, as they're called. All right, thanks for watching.